The summer picnic was still alive with laughter when my grandfather slowly lifted his coffee mug and smiled at everyone gathered beneath the old maple trees. "My family has always been my greatest achievement," he said proudly. "Every one of my grandchildren has made me proud." Then his eyes landed on me, except for the disappointment standing over there. 40 people laughed nervously. A few looked away. Most just kept eating. No one defended me. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 35 years old, standing in the backyard where I'd spent every childhood summer, and somehow I'd never felt more like a stranger. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I reached into my handbag, pulled out a thick ivory envelope, placed it beside my grandfather's coffee cup, wished him a happy family day, and quietly walked toward my car. By the time I'd reached the end of the driveway, I heard shouting behind me. Not ordinary shouting, the kind that makes an entire neighborhood step onto their porches, the kind that changes a family forever. But to understand why that envelope destroyed everything, you have to go back 4 years. To the afternoon, my grandmother whispered one impossible request before she closed her eyes for the last time. If you enjoy stories where patience defeats cruelty and quiet people finally reveal the truth, settle in. This is one of those stories that proves revenge doesn't always arrive with anger. Sometimes it arrives inside a simple envelope. 4 years earlier, Monday mornings usually belonged to everyone else's emergencies. I owned a small financial consulting office in Ashford Ridge, where farmers, small business owners, and retirees came when numbers stopped making sense. By 8:30, my waiting room was already full. One client thought he'd lost his restaurant because of unpaid taxes. Another was convinced the bank had made a mistake on his loan. Most people walked into my office terrified. Most walked out breathing again. That had become my life. Finding solutions nobody else noticed. I'd built the business from a rented desk, an aging laptop, and years of 16-hour workdays. No one in my family ever mentioned that. According to them, I wasn't successful. I was greedy. I cared more about paperwork than people. Those words had followed me for years until eventually they stopped hurting. Or at least I told myself they had. Around noon, my assistant reminded me, "Family Day picnic this weekend." I stared at the note on my calendar. Every year I promised myself I wouldn't go. Every year I found myself driving back to the Bennett estate anyway. Not because they wanted me there, because Grandma always had. She used to squeeze my hand before every gathering and whisper the same thing. "Don't stop coming home, sweetheart, even when it stops feeling like home." After she passed away, those words became harder to keep, yet somehow, I still kept them. The Bennett estate sat just outside Willow Creek, surrounded by rolling fields and an old apple orchard planted by my great-grandfather. To anyone passing by, it looked perfect. Children running through sprinklers, smoke drifting from barbecue grills, music playing across the lawn. 3 generations gathered under one roof. People envied families like ours. They never saw what happened once the guests arrived. I parked farther away than everyone else. Old habits. When you've spent years feeling unwelcome, you instinctively leave yourself an easy escape. Before getting out, I opened my purse. The velvet pouch was still there. I'd carried it for nearly 18 months. I touched it for only a second before closing the zipper again. Not today. Or at least, that's what I believed. My cousin Ethan spotted me first. At 39, he'd inherited our grandfather's confidence long before inheriting anything else. He greeted every guest like the estate already belonged to him. His wife, Melissa, floated through the crowd, collecting compliments she'd never earned. My Aunt Denise stood beneath the patio umbrella, directing everyone where to sit without ever lifting a finger herself. Then there was Grandpa Harold, still standing straight despite his age, still carrying himself like every decision he made became law. When he noticed me, he offered the smallest possible nod, just enough to acknowledge I existed. Nothing more. I smiled anyway. Old reflexes die slowly. I picked up a tray of drinks and helped carry them outside. Nobody asked. Nobody thanked me. But staying busy was easier than standing alone. While setting glasses onto the picnic table, I noticed Ethan lean close to Grandpa. They spoke quietly. Grandpa frowned. Ethan opened a leather folder, pointed to something inside. Grandpa nodded. Melissa glanced toward me. then immediately looked away. It lasted only seconds. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. Years of reading contracts had taught me something. The smallest conversations often hide the biggest decisions. Whatever Ethan wanted, Grandpa seemed ready to give it to him. I couldn't explain why, but for the first time all afternoon, something felt wrong. Very wrong. And deep inside, a memory I'd spent 4 years trying to bury began quietly waking up. 4 years earlier, I still believed that facts could save people. Back then, I hadn't yet learned that some families would rather believe a comforting lie than an uncomfortable truth. Grandma Eleanor had been living in a hospice bed beside the living room window for almost 2 months. She insisted on staying at home, where she could watch the apple orchard she'd helped build with Grandpa Harold nearly 50 years earlier. Even on the hardest days, she'd ask someone to open the curtains so she could see the rows of trees stretching across the hills. The orchard wasn't just land to her. It was her life's work. What almost nobody knew was that the orchard was also drowning. 3 consecutive bad harvests had left the family business buried beneath loans. Equipment payments were overdue. The operating account had been emptied just to cover payroll. Every month, another bill arrived that nobody wanted to talk about. Except me. I spent my evenings reviewing the financial statements Grandpa reluctantly handed over after Grandma begged him to let me help. The numbers were worse than I expected. There wasn't enough cash left to survive another season. Then Ethan arrived with what he proudly called our miracle. He walked into Grandma's bedroom carrying a leather briefcase and enough confidence for everyone in the house. "I found us a solution," he announced. He spread glossy brochures across the dining room table. A development company wanted to lease a section of unused orchard land and build a luxury countryside resort. Ethan claimed the profits would erase every debt within 2 years. "It saves the family," he said. "It saves Grandma's legacy." Everyone wanted to believe him. Grandpa smiled for the first time in weeks. Aunt Denise called it an answer to prayer. Melissa squeezed Ethan's hand like she'd already spent the money. Only I kept reading. The proposal looked impressive until I reached page 23. Then page 41. Then the final section hidden behind the legal disclosures. The projected profits were wildly unrealistic. The developer carried massive debt of its own, and buried deep inside the contract sat one sentence that made my stomach tighten. The Bennett estate itself would become collateral. If the project failed, the family wouldn't simply lose an investment. They could lose everything. I spent the entire night preparing a report. Not opinions, not guesses, just numbers. The next morning, I laid everything across Grandpa's kitchen table. "If this company collapses," I said quietly, "the bank can come after the orchard." Ethan didn't even look at my report. He leaned back in his chair and laughed. "There she goes again. The accountant. Always finding reasons something won't work." Melissa nodded. "You care more about paperwork than people." Aunt Denise folded her arms. "Your grandmother is dying, Claire. The last thing this family needs is another lecture." I looked at Grandpa. He never opened my folder, not once. Instead, he pushed it gently back across the table. "We need hope," he said. "Not another spreadsheet." The room went silent. Across the hallway, Grandma lay quietly awake. She hadn't said a word during the entire conversation, but when our eyes met, I saw it. She already knew. She knew I was right. A week later, Grandpa signed the agreement. For a little while, everyone celebrated. Ethan walked around town talking about the future. He told neighbors we'd soon expand the orchard. He promised new equipment, new buildings, a new beginning. Then, 6 months later, the development company declared bankruptcy. Its owners disappeared, the investors vanished, the lawsuits started, and every promise Ethan had made disappeared with them. The orchard's debt doubled almost overnight. Yet somehow, I became the villain. People whispered that if I had been more supportive, Ethan might have found another solution. At Grandma's funeral, I overheard relatives telling complete strangers that I'd spent more time studying contracts than sitting beside my grandmother's bed. None of them knew. None of them knew that every hospice bill had been paid before it reached Grandpa, that every expensive medication had arrived because I'd quietly covered the invoices, that the nurses who cared for Grandma during her final weeks had been paid through an anonymous trust I'd created so no one would ever know. I never corrected anyone. Grandma wouldn't have wanted me to. After the funeral, Grandpa couldn't bring himself to clean out her bedroom, so I did. Inside the bottom drawer of her dresser, beneath neatly folded quilts, I found a small cedar box. Inside was a single hand-written letter. My name was written across the front. I sat alone beside her empty bed before opening it. Her handwriting trembled across the page. Claire, I know more about this family's troubles than anyone thinks. Your grandfather hides his worries because pride is the only thing he has left. Ethan mistakes confidence for wisdom. And you're the only one willing to carry burdens without asking for applause. Then came the sentence that would stay with me every single day afterward. If the time comes, save this place. Do it quietly. Your grandfather will never accept help if he knows it came from you. Protect the land, even if no one ever thanks you for it. I folded the letter carefully, made a promise to Grandma, and tucked it into my purse. I had no idea that promise would eventually cost me nearly everything I owned, or that 2 years later, I'd walk into Grandpa's kitchen, see 3 unopened foreclosure notices hidden beneath yesterday's newspaper, and realize the family estate wasn't simply struggling anymore. It was only weeks away from disappearing forever. Claire couldn't ignore the foreclosure notices. The next morning, I met with Mr. Whitmore, the attorney who had handled my grandparents' legal affairs for decades. He didn't waste time softening the truth. The bank has already given up, he told me. They're preparing to auction the estate. I felt the room spin. Everything my grandparents had built was about to disappear. I asked one question. If someone else bought the debt before the auction, could the property be saved? He looked at me for a long moment. Yes, legally, it can. That single answer changed my life. Over the next 2 weeks, I mortgaged my office, emptied my savings, and cashed out nearly every investment I'd spent years building. It wasn't enough to buy the estate, but it was enough to buy the bank's loan. The foreclosure stopped overnight. No auction, no eviction, no notices taped to the front door. As far as Grandpa knew, the financial problems had somehow worked themselves out. I never told him the truth. I was simply keeping the promise I'd made to Grandma. 2 years later, at the family reunion, I finally understood why. While everyone gathered around the dessert table, I slipped inside the house and found the leather folder Ethan had been carrying. One glance at the documents made my blood run cold. They weren't protecting the estate. They were preparing to sell it. And Ethan had already convinced Grandpa to sign a power of attorney. I quickly photographed every page before putting everything back exactly as I'd found it. Then I smiled. Because Ethan had overlooked one very important detail. The estate still carried a legal claim, and I was the only person who controlled it. The rest of the afternoon passed as though nothing had happened. Ethan laughed with the neighbors. Melissa talked about the future as if the estate already belonged to them. Grandpa proudly told everyone that the Bennett land would stay in the family for generations. Only I knew that wasn't the future Ethan had planned. I called Mr. Whitmore from behind the old equipment shed and emailed him the photographs I'd taken. 10 minutes later, he called back. I was afraid of this, he said. The paperwork is real. He isn't protecting the estate. He's preparing to sell it. I closed my eyes. So Grandpa has no idea? None. Mr. Whitmore paused. But Claire, there's one thing Ethan doesn't know. He can't sell that property. The trust still holds the original mortgage lien. No buyer will ever receive clear ownership without your approval. For the first time all day, I wasn't afraid. I walked back toward the picnic, determined to give Grandpa one last chance. I caught him alone beside the porch. Grandpa, I said quietly, before you sign anything else, please let me read the papers. He looked at me for a second. Then Ethan appeared beside him. Immediately, Grandpa's expression hardened. He raised his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. You've spent years trying to tell this family how to live. You've done enough. The conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward me. Ethan folded his arms. Melissa smiled behind her glass. I nodded once. All right. That was the last chance I was ever going to give him. I drove straight back to my office. Inside, I printed 4 documents. The trust agreement, the mortgage transfer, the bank payoff confirmation, and Ethan's secret sale contract. I placed them inside a plain ivory envelope. Then I wrote 6 simple words across the front. Happy Family Day, Grandpa. As the sun began to set, I picked up my keys and drove back to the Bennett estate. The evening sun painted the orchard in shades of gold as I walked back toward the family gathering. Most of the neighbors were still there. Children chased each other across the lawn. Coffee cups had replaced barbecue plates. It looked like the perfect family reunion. No one noticed the envelope in my hand. Grandpa stood at the head of the table, smiling proudly as Ethan encouraged everyone to gather for one final toast. "This family has been blessed," Grandpa said. "Our name will stay on this land for generations." Everyone applauded. Then he looked at me. The smile disappeared. "I've been proud of every member of this family." He paused just long enough for everyone to look my way, except for the disappointment standing over there. Silence. No one defended me. Just like every other year. I smiled, walked to the head of the table, placed the ivory envelope beside Grandpa's coffee cup. "Happy Family Day," I said softly. "I think it's time you knew the truth." Without another word, I turned and walked away. Behind me, I heard Ethan laugh. "Don't bother opening it, Grandpa." She's always been dramatic. I reached my car before I heard the envelope tear open. Then, nothing. Absolute silence. I looked back once. Grandpa stood frozen. His hands trembled as he stared at the first document, then the second, then the third. His face turned completely pale. "What is this?" he whispered. "The bank payoff receipt. The trust agreement proving I had quietly purchased the family's defaulted loan years earlier. The mortgage transfer showing the estate had only escaped foreclosure because of me. And finally, Ethan's secret sale contract, signed under power of attorney, ready to sell the entire Bennett estate." Grandpa slowly turned toward Ethan. "You were selling my home?" Ethan stepped backward. "It's not what it looks like." "You don't understand." But everyone understood. The neighbors. My aunt, Melissa. Every person standing there finally saw the truth. The granddaughter they'd called selfish had sacrificed everything to save the family estate. The grandson they'd trusted had nearly stolen it. Grandpa's coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered against the patio stones. "Claire!" he shouted. Not disappointment. Not another insult. Just my name. I opened my car door. "I never wanted the estate," I said quietly. "I only wanted to keep it in the family." Then I drove away. The sale agreement disappeared within days. Once the title company discovered the trust still held the mortgage lien, the entire transaction collapsed before it could begin. Ethan's creditors came looking for answers. Melissa moved out before the month was over. The man everyone believed would inherit the Bennett legacy became the man who almost destroyed it. A few weeks later, Grandpa called. His voice sounded older than I remembered. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. I looked at Grandma's letter lying on my desk. "Because you never would have accepted my help if you knew it came from me." He didn't deny it. After a long silence, he quietly asked if I would come back to the estate. "I'll always protect Grandma's home," I replied, "but I won't keep returning to a place where I'm only welcome after proving my worth." He understood. For the first time in years, he simply said, "I'm sorry." Months later, Mr. Whitmore completed the final paperwork. The Bennett estate was transferred into a permanent family trust that could never again be sold without the approval of every future generation. Grandpa remained there for the rest of his life. The orchard survived. Grandma's wish was fulfilled. And I finally learned something she'd been trying to teach me all along. Protecting the people you love doesn't mean accepting the lies they tell about you. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is quietly place the truth on the table and walk away before anyone realizes it has changed everything.